Welcome to Ask the Source. I'm your host, Josh Reinstein, and I'm here on a beautiful day in Jerusalem on our rooftop studio. My guest today is Einat Wilf. She is a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute. Einat, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Tell our viewers a little bit about what is the Jewish People Policy Institute.
It is a think tank that looks at the Jewish people as a whole in Israel and around the world, looks at trends for the future and what policies we need to make sure are in place so that the future of the Jewish people is positive rather than negative.
You're a former member of Knesset, and one of the issues that you took on is the issue of UNRWA and the perpetuation of the refugee issue with the Palestinians. Can you tell us a little about what is the issue there?
One of the things I find most amazing is that the biggest obstacle to peace is the least known. And I believe that UNRWA, which is the head of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, is the biggest obstacle to peace in the Middle East, certainly between Israelis and Palestinians. UNRWA is essentially a UN agency that is a thinly masked Palestinian political organization that perpetuates the idea that Israel and Zionism can be rolled back decades, and that the Palestinians who left during Israel's War of Independence and their descendants in perpetuity can one day return and reclaim that land and turn the clock back.
The Palestinians have UNRWA, but every other refugee situation in the world, whether it be in Syria or Africa or Asia, is under the auspices of the UNHCR. What's the difference between the two UN bodies?
You're absolutely correct. In the late 40s and 50s, when the United Nations was established and looked to take care of issues of refugees, they established a High Commissioner for Refugees that, you're right, takes care of all refugee situations in the world. UNRWA was established separately, initially not for any bad intention. People just thought it would be very temporary, that within several months the Arab refugees from the war would be resettled in Arab countries and other countries and would be over, like it is in many other situations. But the Arab countries wanted to keep this issue alive. They wanted to send the message that the war is not over. Even though they lost in the war, even though Israel gained independence, as far as they're concerned, as long as the war is not over, in their mind they don't have to admit and acknowledge defeat. And they demanded that the UN create a separate agency that would also include the letters UN, only for the Arab refugees from the War of Independence. And lo and behold, nearly 70 years later, it still exists, perpetuating the notion that the war is not over.
What doesn't make sense to me is a refugee, by definition, is only for one generation. You can't have a second generation refugee because you've been living somewhere, you put down roots. How is it that under UNRWA they have the third, fourth generation refugees?
You're right. This is, again, part of the paradoxes of UNRWA. UNRWA has created a fiefdom where it creates its own rules. It allows people to be called refugees into the second, third, fourth, by now even fifth generation. These are people who have been born in their place, have never been displaced an inch, and yet they continue to maintain the notion that they are refugees from Palestine. And in their mind, Palestine is not limited to the West Bank and Gaza. After all, 2 million of them live in the West Bank and Gaza. It is Palestine that in their mind will one day supersede Israel. And the UN cooperates with this, and the donor countries, even worse, the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, support this organization. And even if they don't like it, this organization keeps alive the conflict by maintaining generation after generation that the war is not over.
You brought up the donor nations. One thing that's phenomenal is that the budget for UNRWA is actually greater than the budget for UNHCR, which is all the refugee issues around the world. How does the UN get away with that?
That is, again, truly remarkable. UNRWA is a unique UN agency in the sense that it is not funded by the UN budget. It is yearly budgeted by donor nations, Western countries mostly, that give it over $1.5 billion per refugee. UNRWA has 4 times, 5 times as much as UNHCR. And again, that's one of the paradoxes where UNRWA is a rule unto itself. The refugees are not treated like other refugees. Even the word refugee doesn't mean anything. These are people who did not escape any place, have not been displaced. Many of them are middle class, have education, have jobs, are integrated into the local economy. but they're only refugees in the mythical, symbolic sense that they expect one day to reclaim all of Palestine and to supersede Israel.
Einat, there are literally tens of millions of people watching the show. What message do you have for our viewing audience?
My message would be that if you happen to be a citizen of one of the donor countries of UNRWA, US, Canada, any European country, Australia, please contact your elected officials and ask them, why are you supporting an organization that runs contrary to everything you believe in and creates the biggest obstacle to peace that there is?
Thank you, Einat, for being on the show, and thank you for tuning in to Ask the Source. I'm your host, Josh Reinstein. Now back to the studio.